The first time I heard my shed was apparently a meth lab. I was halfway through mowing the backyard. I killed the mower and looked up to see my neighbor, Ronnie, waving a newspaper from across the fence like he was signaling an airstrike. "You seen this, Nolan?" he shouted. I walked over, wiping sweat off my forehead. "Seen what?" He handed me the latest edition of the Meadow Glen Monthly, the HOA's little gossip rag disguised as a newsletter. Right there, under a bold headline that read Community Safety Alert, was a blurry photo of my shed with the caption, "Unpermitted structure may be involved in illicit activity," says HOA Chair Sandra Applebridge. I stared at it for a solid 10 seconds. "You've got to be kidding me." Ronnie shook his head. "She's been going around telling everyone it's a drug lab. Said she smelled chemical fumes and saw strange men coming and going from your backyard." I laughed, though it came out more like a growl. The only strange man walking into my backyard was me, and the only thing in that shed was my woodworking gear and a beat-up mini fridge stocked with root beer. I'd lived in Meadow Glen for 6 years, and in that time, I'd mostly kept to myself. I'm not the neighborhood barbecue guy. I'm not lawn-obsessed. I just wanted peace and space to work on my furniture projects after my shift at the auto shop. But Sandra Applebridge, the HOA president, had other plans. She was the type of woman whose voice always sounded like she was trying to talk over someone, even when she wasn't. Platinum blonde bob, oversized sunglasses, driveways full of Amazon packages, and a clipboard that might as well have been surgically attached to her hand. She ran the HOA like a tyrant in Capri's. And now, apparently, she'd decided I was running a drug empire from my 8x10 workshop. I opened the gate and marched into the shed. Nothing inside had changed. My table saw sat where it always did. Shelves of screws, sandpaper, and paint cans lined the wall. I even kept it cleaner than my house, if I'm honest. The only smell in there was sawdust and lemon oil. I popped open the mini fridge and cracked a root beer. "A meth lab," I muttered. "Really?" That night, I got my answer. Sandra showed up at my door with 2 HOA board members in tow, Bob from 3 houses down, who wore his HOA badge like it was a sheriff's star, and Linda, who never spoke unless Sandra did first. I opened the door and leaned against the frame. "Evening." Sandra didn't waste time. "We've received multiple complaints about your shed, Nolan. I'm afraid we're going to have to inspect it." I raised an eyebrow. "You want to inspect my shed?" "Yes," she said, brushing past me toward the backyard like she owned the place. "It's an unregistered structure, and we have reason to believe it's being used for illegal purposes." Bob followed close behind her, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, and Linda just stared at her shoes. I closed the door behind them and followed. Sandra didn't ask. She just yanked the shed door open and stepped in like she was kicking down the door to a cartel hideout. I waited for the gasp, the accusations, the dramatic pointing. Instead, there was silence. She looked around, clearly confused. Her eyes fell on my workbench, then the pegboard of tools, then the stack of cedar planks I'd picked up from the lumberyard last week. "This is woodworking equipment," she finally said. "No kidding," I said. Bob cleared his throat. "Sandra, are you sure this is the right place?" Sandra snapped. "I know what I smelled, and I saw strangers going in there." I crossed my arms. "You mean my brother? He came to help me build a bench for my niece's birthday." "Then why wasn't it registered?" she barked. "Because it's under the size limit that requires a permit. Page 7 of the HOA guidelines, second paragraph." Sandra blinked. She clearly hadn't expected me to know that. I didn't wait. "You printed a false accusation in the newsletter. You told people I was cooking meth. That's slander." "You can't prove that," she said quickly, but her voice cracked. "Oh, I absolutely can," I said. "Your name is in the byline. And Ronnie heard you talking about it at the last board meeting." Bob looked at her. "You said it was confirmed." "Well, it seemed confirmed," she snapped. I stepped forward. "You've got 48 hours to print a retraction, or I'm filing a slander suit." "You're overreacting," she barked. "I was doing my duty to the neighborhood." "Your duty," I said, "is to tell the truth. Not to spread lies because you don't like the fact I built something without kissing your ring. Sandra turned on her heel and stormed out of the backyard. Bob and Linda trailed behind her like scolded puppies. I stood there for a minute, heart pounding. I hadn't planned on playing legal hardball, but when someone accuses you of running a meth lab just because you're not part of their little tea party circle, you don't exactly have a choice. The next morning, things got worse. I woke up to see a bright orange violation notice duct taped to my shed door. Unauthorized structure, pending removal, it said. I ripped it off and marched over to Ronnie's house. She's going nuclear, I said. He nodded. You know she's the one who got old Mr. Porter fined for having too many lawn gnomes. I'm going to sue her, I said. Not just for slander. I'm going after her for harassment, too. Ronnie looked at me like I just handed him front row seats to a prize fight. You need help gathering evidence? I grinned. I need everything you've got. The next week became a war of documentation. I installed cameras pointed at my shed and my driveway. I started recording HOA meetings on my phone. Ronnie helped me dig up newsletters, complaint forms, and emails. He even got me a copy of the HOA's bylaws, which clearly stated that structures under 100 square feet were exempt from permit requirements. Sandra, meanwhile, kept escalating. She sent me 3 more violation notices, all bogus. She got 2 other board members to file anonymous complaints, which Ronnie helpfully confirmed as fake. She even tried to get animal control to investigate me for rats based on a photo of a squirrel chewing an acorn in my backyard. Every move she made, I logged. I built a binder thicker than a phone book. Then I called my cousin Leo, he's a civil attorney over in Brookdale. I sent him everything. 2 days later, I had a lawsuit drafted and filed at the county courthouse, defamation, harassment, and abuse of authority under HOA governance statutes. I wasn't just going to get a retraction. I was going to blow her whole operation wide open. 3 days after I filed the lawsuit, Sandra held an emergency HOA meeting inside the rec center, which was really just a glorified double-wide with folding chairs and a busted vending machine. I showed up early, binder in hand, and took a seat right up front, directly across from the folding table where the board usually sat like it was a courtroom drama. The tension in the room was thick enough to chew. People filtered in quietly, some whispering when they saw me. A few nodded in my direction, others looked away. I wasn't exactly beloved in Meadow Glen, but after Sandra's meth lab accusation, people had started wondering what else she'd made up. Sandra entered right at 7, flanked by 2 board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. She wore a red pantsuit this time, her usual clipboard swapped for a thick manila envelope. Her lips were pressed so tight they looked like they were holding in steam. "Let's begin," she said without waiting for anyone to settle. She launched into a speech about community integrity and misinformation, but her voice was brittle, and her eyes kept darting toward me. I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to. Her panic was doing the work for me. Then she made her mistake. "We are currently reviewing the legal implications of certain baseless accusations being made against this association," she said, her gaze locking with mine. "And we will not tolerate frivolous lawsuits intended to harass our leadership." I stood up and opened the binder slowly. "Point of order," I said, flipping to the page with the state's HOA governance statute. "You're not allowed to use HOA funds to defend yourself in a personal defamation suit. That would be misappropriation of dues." Murmurs rippled through the room. Sandra's face twitched, but she didn't respond. "And since you're calling this lawsuit frivolous in a public meeting," I added, "that's now a second documented instance of slander, this time with multiple witnesses." Bob, who was seated at the far end of the table, leaned forward. "Wait, Sandra, are we paying for your lawyer out of the general fund?" She didn't answer. She gathered her papers and motioned to adjourn, but it was too late. The room had turned. People wanted answers. Afterward, outside in the parking lot, a retired teacher named Ms. Grayson approached me. She'd lived in the neighborhood since it was built and rarely attended meetings. "I don't know what's going on exactly," she said, "but I remember when Sandra told everyone the Johnsons were running an illegal daycare out of their garage. Turned out their grandkids were just visiting for the summer. I added her statement to the growing list in my case file. By the end of the week, Leo had filed a discovery request. Under the law, Sandra was now required to turn over any internal emails, communications, and notes related to her accusations. We suspected she'd been sending messages to other board members, coaching them on what to say if questioned. If we found even one coordinated lie, it would prove intent. The following Tuesday, I came home to find a certified letter shoved halfway into my mailbox. It was from a law firm, one I recognized from a billboard downtown. Sandra had hired them to issue a cease and desist, claiming I was defaming her good name. I handed it to Leo. He read it and laughed. This is the legal equivalent of yelling "nah" in a courtroom. We'll respond, but it's just noise. What wasn't noise was the letter I got the next day from the office of the state attorney general. Apparently, someone had anonymously reported the HOA for misuse of community funds. Someone had claimed Sandra had been using the HOA budget to pay for private legal advice, personal errands disguised as community improvement projects, and even reimbursed herself for research expenses without board approval. I had nothing to do with that report, but I knew exactly who did. The next morning, I spotted Ronnie in his driveway, sipping coffee in a lawn chair. "You report her?" I asked. He grinned. "Let's just say I've kept every newsletter, every meeting handout, and every reimbursement form she's ever printed." "You're a dangerous man, Ronnie." "I prefer diligent citizen." A week later, things exploded. Leo called me at work. The emails came in. "You're going to want to see this." I drove to his office that evening. He laid out the printed thread like a trophy. In one message, Sandra wrote to Linda and Bob, "We need to create enough pressure on Nolan that he either removes the shed or sells. Use the safety angle, people respond to that." In another, she said, "I know it's not a meth lab, but the board has broad authority under perceived threat clauses. Let's lean on that." She knew. She knew it was a lie from the start, and she didn't care. Leo filed a motion to amend the complaint, adding malicious intent and abuse of power. We included the emails, the false complaints, and the misuse of community funds, all neatly laid out in chronological order. Then came the deposition. It was held in a neutral office downtown. Sandra arrived with her lawyer, a stiff man with square glasses and a permanent frown. Leo and I sat across from them, a court reporter clicking away nearby. Leo asked the questions. I just watched. "Mrs. Applebridge," he began, "did you ever personally witness any illegal activity occurring in Mr. Nolan's shed?" "No," she admitted. "Did you ever smell anything you believed to be indicative of illicit chemical use?" "I smelled something unusual once," she said. "It could have been anything. But you told others, including board members and residents, that you believed it was a meth lab. Is that correct?" I expressed concern for the safety of the community. "Did you clarify that it was just a guess?" Silence. "Did you mention to the board that your goal was to pressure Mr. Nolan into removing the shed?" Her lawyer objected, but the question stood. "I don't recall," she said. Leo slid the email across the table. "Would refreshing your memory help?" Her face turned a shade of red I hadn't seen before. That night, I received a call from a local reporter. Word had leaked about the lawsuit and the investigation into the HOA's finances. I gave a brief, careful statement. I was defending myself against false accusations and standing up for homeowners who were tired of being bullied. When the story ran, neighbors started speaking out. One by one, they came forward, people I hardly knew. A single mother whose son had been accused of vandalism without proof. A quiet couple fined repeatedly for a front yard flower box that supposedly violated seasonal color guidelines. A veteran who'd been denied a flagpole because it clashed with neighborhood aesthetics. They were tired. Tired of the intimidation. Tired of being dictated to by someone who'd never asked what the community actually wanted. Sandra tried one last stunt. 2 days before the court hearing, I found a notice taped to my door. Due to ongoing legal disputes, your shed is now under formal review for structural safety compliance. I took it straight to Leo. She's panicking, he said. This is retaliation. She's digging herself deeper. We added it to the file. In court, the judge didn't waste time. Once the emails were presented along with statements from residents, the financial misuse report from the state, and Ms. Grayson's affidavit, it was over. Sandra's lawyer tried to argue that it was all unfortunate misunderstanding. The judge didn't buy it. He ruled in my favor on all counts: defamation, harassment, and abuse of authority. Sandra was ordered to pay damages, real ones, not symbolic, and issue a public retraction. She was barred from holding any position in the HOA for 5 years. The board was placed under temporary oversight until a full audit could be completed. When I walked out of that courtroom, I didn't feel victorious. I felt relieved. I'd spent weeks being painted as a threat. I'd been watched, lied about, and targeted for no reason besides building a shed and not playing lapdog to a tyrant with a clipboard. But I'd stood up. And now she was gone. Ronnie met me in the parking lot. About time someone knocked her off her throne, he said. I clapped him on the back. Couldn't have done it without your paper hoarding skills. He grinned. You ever think about running for the board? I raised an eyebrow. I just spent 3 months surviving a war with it. Why would I want to join? He shrugged. Because someone's got to clean it up. I didn't answer right away, but I didn't say no. A week after the court ruling, I was in my driveway sanding down a cedar bench when a white sedan with government plates pulled up in front of my house. It wasn't a neighbor. The driver wore mirrored sunglasses and stepped out holding a slim leather folder. He introduced himself as Investigator Hughes from the State Comptroller's office. He asked if I had a moment to speak inside. I offered him a chair under the shade of the carport. Instead, it was warm, and I wasn't about to invite a state official into a house that still smelled like wood varnish and motor oil. He explained without much fanfare that the financial report I'd submitted as part of my lawsuit had triggered a deeper investigation. The audit had expanded after they uncovered multiple inconsistencies between Meadow Glen's reported expenses and actual bank records. Apparently, Sandra hadn't just been misappropriating funds for legal consultations. There were entries for consulting fees paid to a company that didn't exist, as well as reimbursements for luxury hotel stays, none of which were ever approved by the board. I leaned back in my chair. What kind of numbers are we talking? Enough to trigger a criminal inquiry, he said. We've looped in the county district attorney. If you're willing, your documentation can help us build the timeline. I agreed without hesitation and handed over a flash drive with the raw files Leo and I had compiled. Hughes thanked me, asked a few more questions about the timeline of the shed incident, and then left as quietly as he came. That night, Ronnie and I sat on his porch with a pair of plastic tumblers filled with iced coffee, watching the sun bleed out over the rooftops. She ever mention anything about a sister-in-law in Florida? He asked. I gave him a sideways glance. Not to me. Why? Pulled up her reimbursement forms after the reporter published that article. One of the checks was for a transportation consultant listed at a P.O. box in Pensacola. I looked it up. It's a UPS store. I let out a low whistle. You think she was laundering HOA funds through a fake vendor? I don't think, he said. I know. The next morning, I got a call from Leo. He'd been contacted by the district attorney's office. They wanted to interview me as a witness in a developing fraud and embezzlement case. Sandra was now under official investigation for financial crimes, and the audit had revealed she'd diverted over $30,000 from the HOA budget over the last 3 years. She used HOA dues to pay for a spa retreat in Sedona, Leo said. Filed it under mental wellness leadership training. She never even left town, I said. Exactly. The interview took place at a government annex building downtown. I sat across from a county prosecutor named Marla Donnelly, sharp as a scalpel and twice as efficient. She asked pointed questions not just about the false accusations against me but about the broader behavior I'd seen at HOA meetings, how decisions were made, who rubber-stamped what, and whether Sandra had ever used threats to silence pushback. I told her everything about the fake complaints, the intimidation tactics, the orange violation notices taped up like warnings. I told her how she'd manipulated the board into compliance using procedural jargon and fear of lawsuits to get her way. When I mentioned the forged signatures on a landscaping contract from last year, a contract Ronnie had already flagged as suspicious, Marla's eyes narrowed. She forged board member approval? Ronnie caught it, I said. He compared the signatures to those on previous documents. 2 were duplicated using the same scan. Would you be willing to testify under oath? Absolutely. That night, Meadow Glen buzzed like a kicked beehive. Word had spread fast. Sandra's name had officially appeared in a public filing, State of California versus Sandra Applebridge. Charges included wire fraud, forgery, and misappropriation of community funds. I expected her to vanish, to hole up behind her blinds and wait for the dust to settle. Instead, she dug in. 2 days later, an anonymous flyer appeared in every mailbox on the block. Printed on expensive paper stock, it claimed that Sandra was the victim of a coordinated political attack orchestrated by radicals who wanted to dismantle the HOA and plunge the neighborhood into chaos. There were even veiled threats about watch lists being compiled of residents who were disloyal. It backfired spectacularly. The next morning, a dozen residents gathered on the sidewalk in front of her house. No signs, no yelling, just standing there in silence. Some crossed their arms, others just stared at her front door. It was a quiet protest, but it said everything they needed to. Sandra peered out through the blinds, then retreated. Over the next week, the interim HOA board installed by a court-appointed administrator began the process of reversing her policies. The fines she'd levied were suspended. The unauthorized complaints were voided. The community newsletter was paused indefinitely pending a redesign. I didn't attend those meetings. I was done playing watchdog. But I did get a letter from the new board asking if I'd be interested in consulting during their restructuring. I hadn't said yes, but I hadn't tossed it either. The trial came 6 weeks later. It wasn't a grand spectacle, just a solid 3-day proceeding in a modest courtroom with beige walls and humming fluorescent lights. Sandra arrived with a new attorney, older and more polished than the last. She looked thinner, her usual smugness replaced with a kind of brittle defiance. I took the stand on the second day. I answered questions with precision: dates, times, file names, documents. I never speculated. I didn't have to. The facts were damning enough. Ronnie testified after me. He brought in a stack of HOA filings, including the forged signatures and the fake vendor invoices. One of them was a reimbursement to a consultant for over $7,000. The address turned out to be Sandra's cousin's apartment. The cousin had already confessed. The judge didn't need long. Sandra was found guilty of multiple counts of embezzlement, fraud, and misuse of community funds. She was sentenced to 18 months in county detention with 5 years probation. She was also ordered to repay the stolen money plus interest. After the verdict, I walked out of the courthouse and stood on the steps feeling the sun on my face. Not triumphant. Just free. Leo joined me a minute later, his tie loose and his jacket over one shoulder. You ever think she started with just one lie? He asked. Probably, I said. Thought it'd be easier than asking permission. He nodded. That's how it always starts. Then it turns into a habit. Back in Meadow Glen, things slowly shifted. New leadership took over. The bylaws were amended to include independent oversight for all major expenses. Residents were given more input. Meetings became less about enforcement and more about collaboration. Ronnie eventually ran for board secretary. Won by a landslide. As for me, I finally finished that cedar bench and left it at the community park with a plaque on the side, built by a neighbor who just wanted to be left alone. It stayed there untouched until the first spring rain. That evening, a woman I barely knew stopped me on the sidewalk. She lived 2 streets over and had never spoken to me before. I saw what you did, she said. We all did. You gave the rest of us permission to speak up. I nodded. Didn't plan on becoming anyone's example. No one ever does, she said. Back at home, I stepped into my shed. The tools were right where I left them. Everything smelled like cedar and linseed oil. The space was quiet, finally, and mine again. I opened the mini fridge, pulled out a root beer, and sat on the workbench. Outside, the neighborhood was changing. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like home. 3 months had passed since the court ruling, and Meadow Glen was quieter in a way I hadn't realized the neighborhood had been missing. The lawn patrols had stopped. The anonymous notes were gone. People actually waved again, not just the forced kind but real ones like they meant it. I was back to my routine, working at the shop during the day, sanding and staining in the evenings. The shed, once a neighborhood scandal, had become a landmark of sorts. More than a few neighbors had dropped by to ask about building one like it. I even helped Ronnie design a small pergola for his back patio. We laughed when he called it code compliant. One Friday evening, I was sorting through a delivery of reclaimed oak boards when a knock came at the front door. I opened it to find a man in a dark blue jacket with a silver badge clipped to his belt. He introduced himself as Detective Reyes from the county's white-collar crimes unit and asked if I still had the emails we'd submitted for the civil trial. I told him I did. He stepped inside and opened a manila folder. We've been going through the audit trail from the HOA's accounts. The fraud division flagged 2 transactions we can't trace, one in late March and another right before the trial. Both were wire transfers to an entity that doesn't match any known vendors. I grabbed a flash drive from my desk drawer. We found something like that when we were preparing for court. Leo didn't use it in the Slander case because it didn't directly support our angle, but we backed it up just in case. Reyes plugged the drive into his laptop and clicked through the files. His posture shifted when he found what he was looking for. This routing number matches one we've been tracking. We believe Sandra wasn't just skimming from HOA dues. She may have been laundering money through multiple HOAs across the county. I blinked. You're saying this wasn't just about Meadow Glen? He nodded. So far we've linked her to board consulting gigs at 3 other developments. All of them reported strange budget shortfalls after she left. That night, I called Leo and told him everything. His voice stayed calm, but I could tell he was already piecing it together. This wasn't just a case of a power-hungry board president gone rogue. Sandra had been running a small-scale HOA racket, siphoning money and hiding it behind fake vendors and shell reimbursements. The next day, Detective Reyes returned with a subpoena for my testimony in a grand jury hearing. I wasn't the only one. Ronnie got one too, along with 2 former board members who'd resigned under Sandra's reign. They'd been quiet during the Slander case, but now that a criminal investigation was underway, they were ready to talk. The hearing was held in a secure downtown building. We weren't allowed to sit in on each other's testimony, but I caught a glimpse of Ronnie as we passed in the hall. He gave me a nod, sharp, certain. When it was my turn, they walked me into a plain room with a horseshoe of officials seated behind tables. A court clerk swore me in, and then the questions began. They asked about the sequence of events, how the fake complaints were filed, the internal HOA processes Sandra had manipulated, and how the financial irregularities had first been noticed. Once again, I stuck to the facts. I didn't embellish. I didn't speculate. I gave them the timeline, the documents, the patterns. 2 weeks later, Sandra was arrested, this time not for civil fraud, but for felony charges, conspiracy to defraud, identity theft, and state-level racketeering. The news broke on every local channel. A blurry video showed her being led out of a gated property in handcuffs, a silk scarf over her face. The footage didn't show her eyes, but I imagined they were the same steely gray that had once scanned my backyard for imagined crimes. I thought that would be the end of it, but then someone else came knocking. This time, it was a woman in her 60s, sharp features, wearing a faded windbreaker with a faded HOA logo from a different community. She introduced herself as Marilyn Green, the interim president of the Oak Hollow Association 2 towns over. She'd read about the case and wanted to know how we'd organized our neighborhood after everything collapsed. I invited her in and pulled out the binder I'd used for the lawsuit. It had grown since the trial, now full of notes on procedural reform, election transparency, and financial oversight. I handed it to her, and she flipped through it slowly, nodding. "You mind if I borrow this format?" she asked. Take what you need, I said. Just make sure your neighbors know what's being done with their money. She smiled, but there was weight in her eyes. They trusted her. That's the part one can't get past. They always do, I said. Until someone doesn't. Marilyn left with a copy of the file and a promise to follow up. I watched her drive off, then sat on the porch and let the silence settle around me. A week later, Meadow Glen held its first community event in over a year that didn't involve fines or citations. It was a potluck in the park organized by Ms. Grayson and a few others who had stepped up after the cleanup. Tables were lined with casseroles, crockpots, and homemade desserts. No one handed out flyers. No one wore badges. When I arrived with a tray of smoked brisket, people actually clapped. I didn't know what to do with that, so I just set the tray down and tried to blend in. Ronnie appeared a few minutes later, holding a paper plate stacked with deviled eggs. You ready for the big question? What question? He leaned in. They want you on the board. Chair, specifically. I shook my head. I'm not a politician. He shrugged. Neither are they. That's the point. I walked over to the picnic tables, refilled my cup, and looked around. Kids were playing tag under the oaks. Someone had brought a speaker and was playing old soul music. The air smelled like barbecue and mulch. I thought about the hours I'd spent building that shed. The quiet satisfaction of designing something with your own hands. The way Sandra had tried to turn it into a symbol of danger. How close she'd come to getting away with it all. Maybe the solution wasn't more rules. Maybe it was just more people paying attention. 2 months later, I accepted the chair position. Not because I wanted power, but because I knew what happened when no one paid attention to how it was used. We rewrote the bylaws that winter. Every financial decision had to be approved by a rotating committee of residents. No one could serve more than 2 consecutive terms. Anonymous complaints were banned. And every meeting had to be recorded and archived online. By spring, the neighborhood felt different. Not perfect, but honest. One afternoon, as I walked home from a committee meeting, I passed by my shed. The oak boards I'd left leaning against the side had dried to a golden hue. I paused, ran my hand along the grain. It had started with a lie. A small one, maybe, but it had been enough to threaten everything I'd built. And in standing up to it, I'd found something I didn't know I was missing: a voice. A purpose. The shed still stood. So did I.